There's a good. It's a good thing that people stay in their cars. It's been a trying morning. So, couple programming notes. One is next week on the 20th, although that doesn't affect us as much. We will be planning on watching Shadowlands. So the folks that are with me in group, it's going to impact us. I've got to figure out another place for us to meet. But I want to go ahead and show that and then finish it on a week from Tuesday. So the 20th is when the board is meeting in here, and so they hijacked the whole room. And so I've got to think that through. I'm standing here just thinking through it. It doesn't really impact us all that much since we're doing groups on Thursday anyway. Is that right? Yeah. So I will let you know what we want to do. Because we're doing groups on Thursday, it doesn't impact us as much. It impacts my groups. We'll have to find someplace else to meet. And then maybe the following Tuesday, we'll watch Shadowlands in here together. And then you'll probably have to watch the rest of it because it spans a couple of hours. So our ability to actually get it completed in class is a little tough to do. So I don't know if I want to take another class time to do that since we've already lost one. So we'll at least begin it and then finish it. You can finish it through the week, and then we can circle back around and take some time to talk a little bit about it the following week. So those of you guys that are in my groups, I'll let you know where we're going to meet. It's not going to be in here, obviously, because of the board meeting. So I think that's probably. Any questions? You guys got anything? Thanks for your patience. I apologize for the delay. It wouldn't have mattered when I had left, given the way the traffic was. So a phrase which I'm not real in love with is, it is what it is. It's like, yeah. So, okay. We've got a few things to get through. My hope is that having lost last week, it's a little bit of a challenge to get through some of this stuff, and I'm not going to speed my way through it. So, we'll get to where we can and then continue on after that. So, I may bump back Shadowlands just so we can get some of this material done before we do that. And I'll just keep you informed so you know what we're actually doing. So. Let me pray, just to get my head in a space that works. Father, thanks for getting people safely to work. Thank you for just the day that we've had and the opportunities we have in terms of the relationships and our perspectives on it and the things that we see in one another and in our relationships that we can learn not only about ourselves but each other as well. Grant us grace and the ability to move into the material we're talking about and how it applies to us on a daily basis, and to lean in on your character and your love for us as well. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, as far as I can tell, we left off talking about the anatomy of control, if that's correct. Did we cover this? Anybody check your notes? I went back a little ways trying to make sure. No? Yes, because you want to avoid it?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. How about this one?
I don't. At least I don't have it down that we even get there.
Okay. Well, let's get here. Huh?
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. Let's start here. The one observation I will make to you, even as we've begun this process of interacting in me reading your journals and having some time to think about it in groups, the whole idea of control comes into play around not only what we say and what we don't say, but also what other people say and how insensitive they might be. And that's part of, I think, what oftentimes comes into play and where the whole idea of control comes in. The thoughts that support it and how I frame things when I get irritated when I say the wrong thing, by its definition, that means that there is a right thing to say. And while it may be more a matter of keeping our mouth shut first before we try to formulate exactly what to say to people, because we can't know what they're feeling. We can't know the landscape of what they're going through. Rather than having something to say, it might be more important to ask the kinds of questions that are off of the theme of help me understand what's going on here. Where are you at with all of this? I think a lot of times the reactions I see people have around some of these things is, well, if I can't ask a question, then I won't say anything at all. Versus the other side of it is that if I can't say anything right, then I won't say anything at all either. The challenge of walking alongside somebody who's in pain through a broken relationship or the loss that they have experienced through death or whatever that might be, a change in life, maybe what we have is the challenge of asking good open-ended questions that invite them to process it out loud. I know a lot of you have been reading in Kubler-Ross's book, and she says, basically says that a grief that is seen is a grief that's healed. A grief that is brought out front is the one that's healed. And that's the very same thing here, is that in some respects, we invite people just to talk about where they are with what they're experiencing and how they go about experiencing it, rather than just trying to make sure that I ask the right question, I say the right thing, because then we lapse into formulaic things. If I ask the right thing, then of course I will get whatever, the person will tell me what they need to tell me. Maybe. I mean, if you enter into the chaos of a lot of people's lives when a loss occurs, they don't know where to start. They don't know what's important and what isn't important. I mean, in a lot of cases, they just simply need somebody to invite them to start somewhere, start anywhere, really. It doesn't really matter, and that really is kind of the key. And again, time and time again, we come up against, if I can say the right thing, do it the right way, then everything will be okay. And that we get, we get very frustrated when the formula doesn't work, and it never really occurs to us that the formula was never intended in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I get irritated when I hear other people say the wrong thing. Again, it's all of that same cluster of trying to understand and walk alongside of somebody. The reality is this: a lot of times if somebody's going to be honest and be forthright about what they're wrestling with, it's not going to be the right thing. As a matter of fact, I have heard more heresies from people over the last 20 years, 30 years of talking to people than I can count anymore. And if I spent all of my time trying to correct those heresies, which, by the way, have nothing to do with heresy, it has everything to do with the person's feelings, then suddenly I try to correct their feelings, and then what happens? They make the conclusion that there's something wrong with me. Because our feelings cut really close to the very essence of who we are. And so when somebody says, don't feel that way, very rarely are any of you going to say that to anybody. I probably put enough fear of God in you to not do that. But at the same time, a lot of times we can say it without even saying it. Because, and you saw it even in a lot of what C.S. Lewis has written. Is that here's the greatest theologian of the 20th century, some would say, and he's saying things that all of us are resonating with here in the 21st century. And the reality is that a lot of times people will jump to attention implying that you need to have this corrected now, because if you get it corrected now, then maybe you won't feel so bad and I won't feel so helpless because I can't help you. And so that comes into the conversation when we're talking about it. So let's turn our attention then to the feelings that come up. And there are 4 different feelings. You guys that have heard this presentation before know these 4. You can add in here a bunch of other ones. But the whole idea of anger is the one that stands probably at the forefront. And anger is part of that effort to maintain control by maintaining distance. The other thing is that I end up feeling like I really don't have the energy to do what I need to do. Anger generates that energy for us. It generates the energy to either kind of invite people to stay away, or to, and by so doing, if they respect that, then it confirms what we already believe, and that is my anger is, quote unquote, so out of control that nobody can be around me. And the moment in which things happen in life that we can't control, we will either get discouraged or get angry. And that's broad brushstroke. I'll be the first to tell you that. At the same time, a lot of times we may get angry, but the only thing that we think is appropriate to the people around us is looking discouraged. And so what ends up happening is we absorb all of the emotions that come along with the anger internal to us. And that's and I would remind you, I don't think I told this story. I think some of you guys know it, of the story of Love's Canal. And some of you guys may remember this. And 70, 80 years ago, outside of Niagara Falls, they decided to build a community in what they thought was an empty field. And as they did and built it all, probably 25 years has passed, and the people in the community started showing signs of cancer and birth defects and all manner of things that would suggest something was going on, particularly in this little community called Love Canal. It hit the newspapers. You can look it up. It hit the newspapers. It hit the New York State Health Department, and they were wondering, why in the world do we see all of this just in this one little location? And when somebody began to do some research and tried to figure out why this was the case, they began to follow a trail and wondered why, and found out that about 70 years before that time, the governor in the state and the legislature got this brainy idea to create a canal between the Niagara River and the St. Lawrence Seaway. So they started to build it. Now, this became a government project that was kind of a bridge to nowhere, because they got partway into it and didn't have enough money to complete the job. So basically what they had on their hands was one very long canal built into the ground with concrete sides to it. And they said, what are we going to do with this thing? Well, it wasn't all that far away where there was something called 3 Mile Island. Does that ring a bell with anybody? It's a nuclear generation plant, a electricity generation plant. Well, what are we going to do with all the toxic waste that comes from 3 Mile Island? I got an idea. Let's bury it in the canal. Great idea. Ship off all of these 55-gallon drums of toxic waste from the nuclear power plant, bury it in the canal, bury it with 50 to 75 feet of dirt underneath it all. There, it all looks better. And then somebody says, hey, there's an empty field over here. It looks a little bit like a canal, but I don't know about that. And so let's just build some houses there. Great idea. Well, come to find out that they did soil samples, and it was profoundly contaminated. And so they said, okay, well, why? And they dug a little farther down, all the way down to where they finally hit these 55-gallon drums, and they were buried underneath all of this stuff of dirt and gravel and everything else. But what happened? They broke open, and they leached into the water table and poisoned everybody around. Why am I telling you that story? Because we have that same propensity to take emotions that we don't like very much, bury it down deep, there, it's all better, but then it leaches into the emotional water table and affects everything around us. Anger is one of those examples. Fear is too. Fear oftentimes is the same kind of part of it, except that it isn't nearly as contaminating, although it contaminates everything, because what does trust, or what does fear connect to? Trust. And so anger does the same thing. We get angry because things didn't work out the way we had planned it, or God didn't deign to let us in on his plan. And we end up, it contaminates all the emotional water table, and therefore all of the relationships around me. So fear is the same way. Like I said, it tends to poison our relationships because no one out of our fear is trustworthy. The last two is going to be worry and guilt and or shame. The whole idea of worry, and again, I'll remind you that the old English word for worry is literally defined to strangle. When I worry about something, it strangles my view of the future. And so these emotions have a tendency to leach into the water table because I don't want to recognize them. I don't want to talk about them. They get in the way. People run away from me because they're afraid, or I'm too much, or I don't want to be a burden, or whatever else comes flying through our heads. And we manage people's perceptions, and in so doing, isolate ourselves. And everybody around us thinks they're doing so well. Except we're screaming inside because it's just like, I wish somebody could know how bad it feels. Guilt and shame and or shame. I would remind you, guilt has to do with our behavior. Shame has to do with our identity. So not only have I done something bad, guilt, I am bad, shame. And that comes up around our emotions that we're really uncomfortable with, we don't like. And so we end up shaming ourselves into silence and not talking about it because, and here it comes, there must be something wrong with me because I feel this way. And that kind of statement, there must be something wrong with me, is a shame-based statement. There's something inherently flawed. Now, all of those things come into play when we're talking about grief, because grief not only through somebody who has died, but grief through changes in life or loss of an image that I have, or a loss of a future that I'd hoped for, or. And we close ranks because that's what control tends to do, because we think that suffering and pain in isolation is far safer than allowing people to see my pain. The shocking thing about it is the moment I let people see my pain is the moment I validate my pain. Mm-hmm. When I do it in isolation, there's no validation there. There's poisoning, but there isn't validation there. That really is very much a part of the conversation. So you guys have heard me say over and over again, control and trust can't coexist. Well, what about trust, and what does it look like? Because trust isn't what we think. It isn't being blissfully kind of in your happy place and away from people. Trust is far more messy than we think. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly why we tend to shy away from it. Control keeps the world very nicely ordered. But it's messy and ugly. It's persistent. It's persevering. And at times unwavering in its wrestling with God. I know I've reminded you of this before. I'll say it again. There's probably no time that I'm closer to God than when I'm wrestling with Him. Somehow we've gotten the strange idea that my faith is tied to my lack of wrestling with God. And I would flip that script and say it's exactly the opposite. My faith in grabbing onto God, just like Jacob did in a nighttime wrestling match. My faith that He won't destroy me, but He will enter in, is brought about by this wrestling match. Inherently, why do we stay away from people? Because we don't trust them. When we get close to them, we trust them, and we find ourselves and another person. That's the wonder of it all. Is that we don't just find another person there. We actually find ourselves there. And that's what's really remarkable, even about our groups. Is that as long as I keep the stuff in me about everything that's going on or the things that I feel or whatever it is, as long as I keep that stuff in me, everything's cool. Until I bring it out and let people see it. And then I got to struggle with all the emotions that come along with it. So in many of our minds, and I've had a lot of people say this, is why in God's name would I ever want to bring all these emotions out and be a mess and people think I'm a mess and all the other things? Because we still have lessons to learn about accepting our own humanity. That's why. Humans grieve. Humans are angry. Humans feel fear. When one person leaves me, it turns into and metastasizes into, if one leaves me, everybody will leave me. Not just some, not just a few, but everybody will leave me. And that's why we end up in this kind of effort that comes along with it. So the part of this is wrestling in spite of the formulas that we carry within us. Because our formulas are a connection or even a contract with a God that doesn't exist. Wrestling with the God that does, I end up finding the character of a God that I didn't know existed. See, I think all of us as Christians have been sold a watered-down version of Jesus. One that can be controlled and be contracted with, one that I can create trades with. And one of the reasons that we're not real crazy about this whole idea of wrestling is that we don't want to feel weak. There are few things in our lives that make us feel more weak than loss. So what do? We hide it more, or we find connections with other humans to say, I hate this, I don't have any control over it, I feel weak and it terrifies me. And I would hazard to guess that if you were to say that out loud, a lot of people would look at you and say, me too. Me too. A lot of times our days are punctuated by that. So it's allowing our image to God to move from an Old Testament understanding of Him to a New Testament, an Old Covenant to a New Covenant. Because God foreshadowed that in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, that He said, look, I want them to be able to have hearts that are tender and supple, and I can write my law on their hearts rather than give them a law to abide by, so that what? They can not only relate to me as their God, but they can then relate to each other. And that's That's a New Testament, New Covenant understanding. When we get into the shame cycle, when we get into this kind of beating ourselves up and saying all these things to ourselves, we have just made God in our own image. You guys have heard me say that quote before, right? Of Blaise Pascal. God made man in his own image, and he returned the favor. In other words, man made God in his image. And we do that at our weakest moments. We lose our bearings and end up in places like that. So with Job, and we've been talking about Job off and on all the way through this, is the book of Job and Psalms, particularly the Psalms of Lament. And remember, there's a whole book on that. You really want an uplifting read, go to Lamentations. Show no interest in exculpating God. In other words, pronouncing him innocent from responsibility for the tragedy and misery of human existence. The Psalms are raw, disturbing, and brutally honest. It is to an angry and bewildered Job that God appears and speaks. And yet, God later tells his theological sophisticate friends, Eliphaz and beyond, to ask for Job's prayer, adding, "For you have not spoken truthfully about me as my servant has." We forget about Job. We forget about Job. You want to see how messy trust is? Read Job. Because at the end, that's what God said about Job, is he represented me as I am. Why? Because along with a friend of mine who once said, nothing delights God's heart more than our trust. Our trust. Why? Because it's the entry point into relationship. Now, let me show you an example. And again, I've been showing you a few examples out of Shadowlands. This is one of them, and it puts my teeth on edge fairly quickly, partly because of the interaction. The interaction is with Jack after Joy has died, and he finally comes back to Oxford. And he meets with his friends and has this conversation with them. And what I want you to pay attention to is all of the things that we're talking about in this particular area about control and all of that, and how they actually respond to him. Hopefully this won't get washed out. So listen to all of that. I forgot to check my sound here. Okay.
Thank you, President. Anything I can do? Yes, just don't tell me it's all for the best, that's all.
Only God knows why these things have to happen.
God knows, but does God care?
Of course. You see so little here. You're not the creator.
No. We're the creatures, aren't we? We're the rats in the cosmic laboratory. I've no doubt the experiment is for our own good, but it still makes God the vivisectionist, doesn't it?
Jack.
No! No, do. This is bloody awful mess, and that's all there is to it. I'm sorry. I asked. Just not to company tonight. Jack? Yes.
So dig into this. Because somebody starts out with anything I can do. Great first question. In a lot of cases, anybody that is experiencing a loss oftentimes won't know what they need. So when somebody says, I don't know, that's okay. It really is okay. Just don't tell me it's all for the best. The rector, only God knows why these things have to happen. God knows, but does God care? Of course, we see so little here. We're not the creator. Nope. We are the creatures, aren't we? We're the rats in the cosmic laboratory. I have no doubt that the experiments is for our own good, but it still makes God the vivisectionist, doesn't it? jack. No, it won't do. It's a bloody, awful mess, and that's all there is to it. That's the equivalent of us saying, it sucks, and that's it. That's it. We look at the conversations like that, and how often do we end up in the role of the rector? And how often then, on the flip side of that, how often are we in Jack's role place, where we would not necessarily ever imagine somebody like C.S. Lewis looking at somebody and saying those kind of words to him. But what do we have? A flash of anger. And Lewis was doing the only thing he knew to do, and that was what? Isolate. That conversation that was at the end of this, you will see at the end. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But what comes after that is a very big deal. It's a very big deal that I would have you pay attention to whenever it is that we go about seeing it. So now I'm going to turn my attention, talk a little bit about boundaries. Any questions or anything on the control stuff? Okay, so let's keep moving. There's probably no time where we have a greater need for a clear understanding of boundaries. Now again, the minute I say boundaries, don't think walls. That is not what we're talking about. It is not something to isolate ourselves behind. But my ability to walk alongside of somebody else and not run the risk of stealing their pain by feeling it for them, it's necessary for me to understand where boundaries fit in. So, just a quick review. In the spiritual world, they define who I am. They define my soul. You hear me talk all the time about Proverbs 4:23. Guard your heart your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. That leads into a longer conversation about the well, which I am not going to belabor right now. But boundaries frame and protect our soul. And the soul is all of what we feel, all of what we think. It's used interchangeably in Scripture with the heart. There's a lot within it that flows out of it into the blessing of other people. And if we end up stopping that up, we get into a lot of trouble. So once I get clear about what is me and what is not me, which is the other aspect of it, is Proverbs, the writer of Proverbs says, the heart knows its own bitterness. No one shares its joy. No one can know how you're experiencing their loss. No one can. We can have empathy for, if we've taken any time at all to explore our own landscape of our hearts, it's not only to own it, but it's also to have the capacity to see it in others and call it out. And invite them to actually share with us the bitterness and the joys. So when we talk about my grief versus your grief and the nature of what it is, we love prescriptions. We love to say, well, how do I do this? Versus, maybe it's not how, but what? What is it? What is it that we're feeling in the nature of what's going on in there? And that defines me separate from another person. Again, we see separation as isolation instead of being close, standing on the boundary line between these two hearts or these two souls. C.S. Lewis once said, we don't have a soul, we are souls. So the interaction between these souls has a boundary line, and they share with each other what's going on in there. So me and not me, and then the 2 and 4, and you might add with the Galatians 6:2 verse and 5, bear one another's burdens. And then later it says, and every man should carry his own load. How do I manage to be responsible to somebody versus for somebody? Being to someone is where empathy comes into play. My ability to enter their world, to see how they see it through their eyes, not without becoming their eyes, and entering in because it's being responsible to somebody rather than for them. For is the nature of when they're carrying something so big they can't carry it themselves, the boulder, then yes, indeed, I need to come alongside and carry it for them, for a time, not forever, for a time. The other thing I would add, the two, would be the preposition with. Being responsible with somebody is partly empowering them to own their own emotions, to own their own heart. It's not to do that for them, but we have a variety of assaults that occur. And recognizing when those happen, then coming alongside of somebody and being responsible to them in terms of empowering them. So the other thing about boundaries is that boundaries always have a gate in them. And I am the gatekeeper. You're the gatekeeper for your heart. No one else is your gatekeeper. The challenge of having good boundaries is that we have lots and lots of people that love to tell us how to manage our own gate. And they may play a variety of cards on us in terms of, well, I'm family. I am inherently safe. Even though there is no evidence to suggest that at all. Which goes back to talking about safe people and everything else that you've heard me hound you about. But having gates and allowing us to say, no, not now, not ever. In a lot of ways, we find out the people who may not have ever heard anything about boundaries. And I recognize that when I talk about this, that, in a lot of ways, I'm equipping you with information that makes it really hard to go out into the bigger world because most people really don't understand boundaries at all. As a matter of fact, they see boundaries as alienation and isolation rather than connection. But I can't be intimate with somebody who I am the same as. Intimacy occurs between two people, and that means there has to be some boundaries between them for me to be able to own my own stuff and then own my heart enough to give it away. So it's me and not me. It's the nature of my emotions in terms of what's mine and what isn't mine, the two and the four. So examples of boundaries within grief, within the context of grief, is taking the time for self-care. Self-care is not synonymous with selfish. It's interesting that we, in the physical realm, we never cast aspersions on people that take care of themselves. Regular doctor appointments, regular dentist appointments. We don't think anything of that at all. But the minute they start taking care of their heart, we say, stop being so selfish. So taking time for self-care, one of the biggest challenges in grieving is taking time for this, which means what? Maybe time alone, maybe time for journaling, maybe time for reflecting on what's going on in there and the nature of what goes on in there. The other part that goes along with this, which again, you've heard me say over and over again, is presence over profundity. There's something I came to a revelation last night. You guys you can take credit for it. Because every time I sit and read your journals and then react to it, some crazy thought comes into my head and it ends up in a comment. But the reason I say that in this idea is that in a lot of cases, when we say that God is silent, maybe he's doing that. He's being present, not necessarily pounding us with words. He's being present. The biggest challenge we have when we draw ourselves up into a little ball and begin licking our wounds, we forget about the fact that we're surrounded. It's very easy. I mean, if you imagine a moment in time where somebody is really, really frightened, they go to where? A corner, because they can limit the exposure. And they turn their backs to people and they ball up. And even though they're surrounded by people that love them, they would never know it. I would never, and I would underscore never, I would never be arrogant enough to say to anyone how the process should go or what they should think about God. I will never do that. Because it's your journey and your story, not mine. I will certainly do whatever I can to understand it. But in a lot of cases, and I know it from my own life, is that when God is silent, that's not effing good enough. That's the bottom line. That's just not good enough, God. I want the pain to go away. I want you to reveal your plan to me. Just like Job, that's not good enough. We oftentimes, in the presence of our own loss and our own sorrow, miss the obvious things. There's a story once told of a guy. He arrives at heaven's gates and he's doing this, stamping his feet and saying, God, where were you? And it happened that he died as a result of a flood. And God, in this fictional interaction, says to him, so you were waiting on your roof for people. And yeah, I was waiting for you to save me. It's like, okay. So who came by? Well, a rescue boat was, but I was waiting for you. And who else came by? Some people that were in another boat and they offered to help me out, but I was waiting for you. And God looks at him and says, I didn't show up. See, we overlook the really obvious people in our lives that God has delivered into our lives that are God with skin on because he knows our frailties. How can an immaterial being relate to a material being or vice versa? It's tough. It's really tough. We get into sorrow and we get really concrete. That's just the nature of our sorrow. So there's more to that, and even as I was thinking about that when I was reacting to journals last night, was it prompted me to go back into my own heart and say, what the heck is going on here? I have staked decades-long war with God because he didn't deliver. And then when I go back over and rewind the tape, there are person after person who ends up showing up and inviting me to share what I'm experiencing with them. And I'm just stubborn enough to say, yeah, that's cool. That's fine. Yeah, that's all right. It ain't good enough. And I end up like Job. So, some other parts of this is context and connection versus content and education and thinking rightly. We make the mistake that people in sorrow need the right words. It's like kind of verbal alchemy. You know, I mix all the right things together and then I'll have something good come out. It is vitally important to understand the context of what people experience. And you can't know that in their words. You can't. You really can't. So it is a hazard, and I would say even a blind spot for those of us that are in academia to believe that more words, more content, more education will fix things. They help. They provide context. They give us an opportunity to understand, but sometimes understanding is not the equivalent to experiencing connection. I can grasp content. That's not that hard. So, distance is also a part of it. We need time to breathe emotionally. Many years ago, in one of my first mental health jobs, I worked in a community mental health center, and I had a lady that I worked with. She was kind of a mentor to me. She had a little boy who was, 6 or 7 years old, and he was diagnosed with acute myelocytic leukemia. That doesn't afflict little kids. It usually afflicts 50-year-olds. And eventually, they went through all the chemo and everything, and eventually Corey died, the little boy. And one of the things that Peg did and her family did that really caught my attention was, one, there was no graveside service. It was only for the family. And two, they left town. They literally left town so they could grieve as a family together. Yeah.
How do you discern the difference in distance and boundaries, like emotional distance and geographical distance, but particularly emotional, of being withholding connection and cutting someone off, and being oh, I'm just leaving them because I can't handle it, which might be what's best for you, but ends up being really hurtful to them.
Yeah, well, and there's no precision here at all. I mean, to some degree, my self-care oftentimes is to the exclusion of other people. I think the challenge is that we end up not doing self-care because we're trying to manage other people's perceptions about what we're going through. And, the discerning kind of the point where even self-care is isolation versus really true self-care is another point of really just discernment. I think we have to have safe enough people in our lives who we walk that through, and they're able to say, beware. They won't tell us not to, but they tell us, beware, that if you go down that path, there's this that can happen. Either way, I'm still your friend. I still love you. I'm not going anywhere. But I think the distance is for a time. It isn't forever. There certainly are, and this is another conversation even that takes us into safe people and so forth, but there are some people that I really need to keep that distance all the time. But other people, I need the distance just to emotionally breathe. And that's that. I would encourage y'all to not be searching through the things I'm saying and congealing it into a principle or a formula to be able to say this is what I should do, because the connection is really the key here. And I have served in that role a lot of times with people that are going through grieving, and they kind of say out loud the things that they're wrestling with and the distance that they may need to certain people. And it's okay, let's talk that through. What does it look like? And I'm rarely pointing them to how will it be perceived. My question usually is what is it you need? Because we tend, whenever we start into this process of trying to manage other people's perceptions, we are already down the road of denying our own need. We're already down that road. Because something has to give. And usually our diminishment of need really serves the purpose of containing my pain. So the other one that really, I often say, puts my teeth on edge is this crap about time heals all wounds. No, it doesn't. It metastasizes them if you do nothing about it. If somebody had said that to me after I fell off the roof and said, "You're fine, walk it off," I would have been permanently disabled. See, it's what we do with time that matters, not whether it will. Time in and of itself doesn't heal wounds at all. And I think inherently we know that in our head. but in our hearts we're still scrambling to try to figure out how to survive the assault that seems to have just occurred to us. So with boundaries, and again, it's a brief overview. It's the backdrop to all the things that we're talking about within this context. And there's always kind of this multiple focus with all of you. You know, it's like not only does my heart turn toward how can I walk with people that I care about, but also how do I just care for my own heart, and not, you know, staying away from as much as I possibly can all of all the comparisons that crop up all the time. And you know, I hound people all the time about comparisons, not so much because they're comparing, but more because it robs the validity of what they're experiencing. It's like, well, I don't have it so bad. And the minute that's usually what we end up saying, and that's it. We don't really say compared to, because that would trigger us to say, wait a minute, what am I doing here? So the boundaries piece is an important part of a respect for another person. Actually, having good boundaries is the most loving thing you can possibly do for anybody, including just caring for your own heart. And we kind of lose sight of that very easily, particularly when people are in pain. All we want to do is try to get it to go away. And that's understandable. There are lots and lots of people in this room for sure that have tender hearts toward people that really, really want to help. That is absolutely wonderful. But helping without boundaries is not really helping. It's more managing ourselves through other people, rather than actually coming alongside. I've told you before about the definition of paraclete, right? Paraclete in the Greek means one called to come alongside. It's the same word that's rendered counselor in Scripture. And the key there is alongside. It really is when we're talking about a lot of these things. So the last dimension I want to take some time, and we'll just kind of tiptoe in and then finish it up next week, because it is it's a lightning rod, and that is this. The one overall observation I will make to you that occurred to me many years ago, the more I've taught about forgiveness and I've taught about grief, is how much of an overlay these two things have. When you look at the process of forgiveness, it mirrors in a lot of ways grief. It mirrors in a lot of ways grief. So in many cases, I wouldn't say all, but in many, many cases, the road to healing in grieving leads through forgiveness. It passes through forgiveness. Whether that's a broken relationship, whether that's death, well, whatever it is. Now, I'll be honest. I told you this even when I told you my story. Is what made me so mad was that my dad abandoned me. And you look at that from a reality point of view and say, how is that even possible? It's not like he wanted to die. It does not matter. The impact on me was, I am alone, he left me, and I'm mad. I'm mad. So the irony is that within the context of even my grieving and working through it with my dad was to, quote unquote, forgive him. I had to release my dad, and that's exactly what we don't want to do, right? I mean, saying goodbye actually represents two losses, not one. It represents not only the release of the person, but also a re-experiencing of the loss. That's why people put it off. It's like I can push it far enough away that I don't have to contend with this. And that's exactly why we don't do it. Because not only am I admitting that the person is gone in whatever context, but I am also having to admit that they're gone again, particularly when I put it off. So we have to have some of this conversation. The first and foremost of the perpetrators in terms of forgiveness is the ultimate one, and that's God. Now, this sounds hilarious. This would probably make the eyes spin of the people in school of theology. Is forgiving God. But I would remind you a lot, and many of you have heard me say this, is my shorthand definition of forgiveness is releasing the person from my demand they change. In God's case, it's accepting fully who He is. There's a lot I don't know. There's just a lot I don't know. And I demand something in it. So there's that piece of it, particularly in and around loss. The second piece of it is, why forgive? Because we've been forgiven. There's that too. God is the ultimate creditor. And I've told you all the story before from Scripture of the ungrateful servant and all the size of the debt he owed that was forgiven. And he goes out and chokes his friend for pocket change and all of the things that really go along with that. And Peter basically is saying, tell me the limits of my forgiveness. And Jesus is saying, oh, by the way, it's infinite. 70 times 7 is not just 490 times, and I'm counting. 70 times 7 is literally, he's saying, infinity on infinity. Because 7 is the perfect number. It's the divine number, some would have us believe. So why forgive? Well, he who is much forgiven will forgive much as well. So there's that. The second one is me. Corrie ten Boom once said, after she had forgiven somebody, the prisoner that got set free tonight, and that prisoner was me. Whenever I have my hands around somebody's throat and saying they owe me, I won't let go, and now I'm officially chained to them. So forgiveness is a means of freeing me. It allows me to act with some measure of freedom. The third one, obviously, is the other person, and freeing them, like I said. Forgiveness, in a lot of ways, is releasing the person from my demand that they change. And then the last one is the community of believers. That goes back to what my example was with Love's Canal. Because the lack of forgiveness in me seeps into the emotional water table. One of the definitions of unforgiveness I have said before is unforgiveness is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're willing to make that trade just to make a point to somebody who really isn't noticing. Mm-hmm. So, okay, we'll stop there, pick it up next week. I think we're going to push off Shadowlands until we can watch it together. So we'll finish this up and then get to that. See ya.